Welcome to the first session of the Culinary Medicine Training in ICM 1. I'm Dr. Chris Dahmer. I'm the Director of the Center for Integrated Medicine at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, where since 1991 we have been conducting NIH-funded research, providing clinical care, and offering education in a wide variety of topics in the field of integrated medicine. And if you're not familiar with integrated medicine, it's essentially the integration of conventional therapies and complementary therapies. So that includes things like meditation, mind-body medicine, acupuncture, yoga, and nutrition, which is the focus today and is the focus of the majority of my work. And I'm here today at the beautiful teaching kitchen of our community-based partner, the Institute for Integrative Health, who's been working with us on offering this training. And we look forward to seeing you here when in-person education returns. In the meanwhile, we've got an exciting lineup of material for you today. There is an evidence-based PowerPoint presentation that gets into practical nutrition topics that are going to be relevant to you in your own lives and to patient care. This includes popular diets, overcoming barriers to healthy eating, and a focus on the Mediterranean diet. Then we're going to have 3 fun and engaging guided cooking sessions in Mediterranean diet-aligned recipes that I think you're going to find practical and fun. And then finally, we're going to have a live Q&A session where you can take any questions you've had on the presentation, on the recipes, and so on and so forth. So we hope you find this content informative, practical, and fun, and I look forward to seeing you in the Q&A. Okay, so we're going to begin with the lecture before getting into the cooking and ultimately the live Q&A. And as I mentioned in the intro, this is practically oriented nutrition education. And I'm going to start really with a history of nutrition in medical practice, get into nutrition education for physicians, which you'll see during the course of your training, then look at popular diets, because these are the types of dietary approaches that your patients are going to be following and that maybe you yourself have ascribed to. Then talk a little bit about the transition in thinking into away maybe from the restrictions of popular diets, although if that's what works for you or a patient, there's nothing wrong with that, but into a more permissive approach of nutrient density. Then finally, a really important topic, and that's overcoming patient barriers to healthy eating and barriers that we all face. This is something that in clinical practice is going to be incredibly important. Then we'll take a shift into culinary medicine itself, what it's all about, what some of the preliminary evidence is, and then finally take a deep dive into Mediterranean diets. We're going to be, over the course of your training, looking at a number of different popular diets, but starting with Mediterranean diets for a couple different reasons. Their high feasibility, quite a bit of evidence behind them. We'll get into some of the practical considerations. So before talking about culinary medicine, we'll first talk about food as medicine. And this is a term you've probably heard about. And in it, there's been books written on the subject. There have been symposia, many public lectures. There's one that I gave a number of years ago, and even a coalition of like-minded professionals in the area. So this is a term that has entered the popular consciousness. It's not a new term by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, it goes back, way back, about 10,000 years to Ayurveda, which is the first organized medical system of record. And if you haven't heard about Ayurveda, it is heavily used spices and herbs such as turmeric, which you see here, for medicinal purposes. And our scientific progress has shown that turmeric has strong anti-inflammatory properties. It's a potent NF-kappa B inhibitor, among other properties. Just don't get it on your clothes or hands because it's not going to come off. We fast forward a few thousand years into traditional Chinese medicine, which is an area where our center has had quite a bit of experience with NIH funding of things like acupuncture and herbs and so on. But foods and food components were used in traditional Chinese medicine as well, or called TCM. So if you've ever been to a TCM pharmacy, you would see, as you see in this picture, foods, basically, food components. And mushrooms were a big part. Particularly for modulating the immune system, which is on everybody's mind now. but some of the mushrooms that you see here, shiitake, maitake, and so on, have been shown to increase natural killer cells and help mount an immune defense. And even our own Western medical system has its roots in food. In fact, it was Hippocrates who gave rise to the moniker, and he said, "Let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food." In his day, foods like garlic were used to stimulate the immune system, which we've had evidence to show that, to support cardiovascular health. Artichokes, olive oil, which is strongly anti-inflammatory due to the polyphenols it contains, and so on. But over the course of time, nutrition sort of took a back seat in medical care. And if we look at some of the data on nutrition education in medical school, it's quite scant in terms of the training, although that's changing. But in 2014, the last time data like this had been published, only 29% of U.S. medical schools met the minimum 25 hours of required nutrition education. So that's not much time. The requirement is not a whole lot of time, 3 days over the course of 4 years. And this was down from 2004. And recently a paper was published in JAMA that reflected the fact that really there's no requirements at all during residency. And there was a call for more practical nutrition education like this. So nutritional biochemistry is important to have an understanding, but patients are going to ask, well, what diet should I eat? And not necessarily vitamin E metabolism or something like that, which I spent years doing my doctorate on. But really, we need to get into the practical matters like we are in this course. And I thought this was a strong statement in the JAMA paper that medical education should match the interest in nutrition among patients and physicians with more action, which is exactly what we're doing at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. Unfortunately, where we are now, though, is that most physicians understand, from a big picture, it's important to eat a healthy diet, but what does that mean to patients? It can mean a lot of different things. These are the types of dietary approaches. When a patient wants to make changes, generally they're going to go to something like you see here. And the good news is that every diet listed here, with one exception, and as you scan, you can probably guess which one it is. It's the Hollywood cookie diet. Every other one has supportive clinical data for it. Okay, so there's a lot of ways to eat healthy, but it can be confusing to patients because there's quite a bit of conflict, really, between these diets, at least on the surface. If you look at low fat versus low carb, paleo versus vegan, or certain other types of specific approaches, whether it's low FODMAP or intermittent fasting or gluten-free diets. But these are the types of diets, and a lot of times proponents think that their way is the only way. So this, again, presents a lot of confusion for patients. And we have this sort of pitting one against the other, which diet is best. And I can tell you right now, no one diet is best for everybody. If anyone tells you it is, they've got more to learn. Okay, there's a lot of variability in this, a lot of individuality that can be at the genetic level, can be at the level of the microbiome, can be metabolic reasons, and to be honest, things like taste and preference, ethics, whatever it may be, there's a lot of influences that go into this, such that these questions really aren't the right ones to ask the low fat versus low carb, vegan versus paleo, and so on and so forth. And the researchers themselves often sort of become experts in a particular type of diet and can blur the line between scientist and advocate, which can be a problem. But there's data for all of these different types of diets, and we'll look at some of it. But first, I'll pose the question to you, what do you think the most common outcome is in these diet studies? Weight. Although this actually would suggest that it's body composition. You look at the tape measure, but weight is what is studied most frequently. And the good news is that all of the diets that we saw pitted amongst one another on a previous slide, low fat, low carb, paleo, and vegan, can help for weight loss. So we see systematic reviews of many of these diets here showing weight loss. So if we look at low fat versus low carb seems to be a little bit better in most of the studies, but low fat is still a feasible way if we do it in a proper whole food basis we'll look at in a few slides from now, versus kind of your standard American diet. And same thing in paleo versus vegan. So any of these diets can be options for weight loss. Obviously, health doesn't end with weight. So if we look at things like cardiovascular disease risk factors, both low-fat and low-carbohydrate diets and systematic reviews and meta-analyses of human RCTs show these as effective ways to manage cardiovascular disease risk. And I think it was low carbohydrate came as a surprise, when some of these studies were being done in the early 2000s. But really, it has been pretty consistently replicated. So both of these diets are effective ways, as are vegan and paleo diets. So again, systematic reviews of human clinical trials show reductions in LDL, increases in HDL, reductions in blood pressure, fasting blood sugar, and so on. Right? So these are all effective ways, despite all the sort of fighting that goes on, the conflict on social media or with influencers or even with some of the researchers. Any of these pathways can be good with some caveats, and that's what we're going to do throughout the culinary medicine session, is look at what are some special considerations that need to be taken on a vegan diet or a paleo diet or a keto diet. We're going to look at all these kinds of diets over the next couple of years. But I will also, despite the seemingly different, vastly different areas of focus, there is some common ground for these diets working in the real world. And there's a lot of acceptable answers to this, but I'll let you reflect for a second on what you think might be. What are some of the common ground between low fat and low carb? They seem opposite, right? What are some of the common ground? Well, one answer is really how is it implemented? So most ideas are nothing but execution. How do we actually do it? So if we look at low fat, for example, if one is doing a low fat diet with the pictures you see on the top, where you see ample protein, high amounts of fiber, nutrient dense leafy greens, and if there's grains, going to be whole grains and so on. All right, so it's going to be satiating with the protein and the fiber. The fat, well, not much, is you got some of the omega-3s and salmon, as you see in this picture, versus something on the bottom. That would be a low fat diet too, but highly refined, lots of sugar and refined carbohydrates that are going to generally cause metabolic problems. Okay, so we stick with the real food approach on the top as opposed to sort of the packaged food. The same holds for low carbohydrate diets. If one is eating a low carbohydrate diet like you see on the top, with once again the good protein sources, the fiber, the healthy fats from things like avocado or salmon or whatever the case may be, versus the Atkins bar on the bottom. Having an occasional Atkins bar, having an occasional whatever it might be in the low fat side is okay, but when one makes that type of stuff the basis of the diet, running into problems. I think when we look at the something like these Atkins bar, there's quite a bit of artificial sweeteners which have been shown to damage the gut bacteria among other issues. So really want to stick to the real food approach. And one way to do that is really to almost have a shift in the paradigm and to getting away from this low fill-in-the-blank philosophy, where whether it's low calorie or fat, carb, protein, animal foods, whatever it is, because that creates this focus and a mentality of denial, right? I can't have this. Better approach, it may seem subtle in a matter of semantics, but really it's not, is to focus on a diet that's high in nutrients, or a nutrient-dense diet. You may have heard about this, and there's a number of ways to quantify. Some will look at it as the number of nutrients per calorie, and that's okay, but that would penalize foods like avocado or salmon or olive oil or those types of things that you see listed here, because they're more calorically dense, as we'll see. Better would be to really just focus on whole foods instead of processed foods. It's not sexy advice, but it's also quite feasible. What are foods that great-great-grandparents would have eaten? Something like that would resonate with patients. It can understand real food, and not stuff that's highly refined, despite what it says on the front, whether it's low fat or low carb, whatever the case may be. And color in the diet is another indicator of nutrient density, and this is due to the carotenoids and flavonoids, polyphenols. We'll look at some of those as we go along. But first, really wanted to take a real practical lens to what nutrients are. When we talk about nutrient density, we first need to understand nutrients. And there are three macronutrients and then thousands of micronutrients. So we'll look at it in this distinction here. The macronutrients, they provide energy for the body, which is most often measured as calories. And there are three macronutrients: protein, carbohydrate, and fat. Then you get thousands of different micronutrients, many of them. They don't provide any energy for the body, but they are just as important as the macronutrients because many of these are needed as cofactors in essential physiological processes. So vitamins and minerals, for example, without these, you can develop deficiency and die, actually. And then you get, again, thousands of non-essential micronutrients that, while they're not technically essential, have many health-promoting properties. Okay, so we'll look at each of these two broad categories and some representative examples of them. So starting with the macronutrients, we'll start with protein, and lots of different sources. You see some of them pictured here. There are two main types. There are complete proteins and incomplete proteins. Complete proteins contain all of the essential amino acids, and these are amino acids that the body can't produce. They have to be obtained in a diet, necessary for survival. And most animal proteins are complete. Not all of them. There are certain things like, actually, collagen, which is very popular these days, is not a complete protein. Pork rinds. So there's a few things like that but the vast majority of them are. Then the incomplete proteins, now most plant proteins are incomplete, but they can be combined to become complete. And this, you see this in traditional cultures, things like rice and beans. One's missing lysine, the other's missing arginine. You combine them, you've got complete protein. Right? And it doesn't have to necessarily be done in the same meal, but we do need to be aware of getting a full spectrum of complete proteins. So these are broken down and contain 4 calories per gram. Next up are carbohydrates, and there are technically no essential carbohydrates. This is where ketogenic diets come in. That said, a lot of carbohydrates getting carbohydrate in the diet is sort of the preferred energy source for most people. So there are 2 main types here. There are simple and complex. Simple essentially are monosaccharide and disaccharides. You see some of them here. Complex are polysaccharides and oligosaccharides, and this includes starches and fiber. And from a caloric perspective, they contain 4 calories per gram, except for fiber, which are non-caloric. And I don't have it on the slide here, but there's actually 2 types of fiber. There's insoluble fiber, which you probably think of when you think of fiber. These are, things like psyllium, which would be metamucil, those types of things. Then you have soluble fiber, which are basically feed the gut bacteria. You're going to learn more and more about that in your training. These are sometimes called prebiotic fibers. All right. And digestion of carbohydrates actually starts in saliva. One of the reasons why amylase enzyme, for example, is there. It's really important to chew our food and eat as mindfully as we can. The last of the macronutrients is fat. There are 2 essential fatty acids that we need. Interestingly, one's an omega-3 and one's an omega-6. So we hear more and more about the importance of getting omega-3 in the diet, and that's true. Most people eat far more omega-6 than omega-3, which can cause inflammation in the body, but we do need both. Multiple types here, so they're all based on the carbon-carbon bond structure. You have saturated fat. As you see in the slide here, saturated fat is not necessarily unhealthy. Just as at one point in time, we thought that fat was unhealthy in and of itself, and we realized, well, we need to paint with a finer brush. The same goes for saturated fats. Some saturated fats are indeed unhealthy, many are not, and may actually be health promoting. Then you get monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats as well. And fat, as you'll notice here, is more calorically dense than the other 2 macronutrients at 9 calories per gram, which is one of the reasons that we did see a real focus on low-fat diets at one point in time. But as we came to realize, it's as much the quality of the calorie and not just the quantity of the calorie. Both matter. Okay, switching gears to micronutrients. Again, these don't provide energy for the body, so there's no calories here, but they're just as important. So you see the vitamins listed here, 13 of them. We don't produce these endogenously and have to be obtained through the diet. And one vitamin that's on a lot of people's mind these days is vitamin C. We tend to think about it, about the immune system, but a lot of times the vitamins are pigeonholed into, well, this vitamin does that, this one does the other, but they all have multiple functions. So vitamin C is involved in collagen synthesis, the production of neurotransmitters, metabolism of cholesterol, and so on. Got an orange there. When most of us think of vitamin C, they think of oranges or citrus. But I'll let you ponder for a second what some other sources of vitamin C might be. Okay, so lots of different fruits and vegetables. You see them listed here. There's a time and place for vitamin C supplementation, but most people can get quite a bit through their diet, and they're getting a bunch of other nutrients at the same time. If we look at the other essential micronutrients of minerals, this is a class of 16 compounds essential to health. There are macro and trace that you see listed on the slide. As you can probably deduce, macro we need more of than we do trace. Once again, we don't produce them endogenously and have to be obtained through the diet. And calcium is one. Again, it's typically thought of, among patient populations for bones, but it's involved in so much more than that. The function of the nervous, muscular, and endocrine systems, among other functions. And a clinically relevant question is calcium. We think of dairy, but many people are either lactose intolerant or possibly have a dairy allergy, or maybe they're avoiding dairy because they're on a paleo or vegan diet. So what are some non-dairy sources of calcium? Tougher. And frankly, if a patient is osteoporotic or even osteopenic, they're probably going to want to take a calcium and vitamin D supplement because you can get it from things like leafy greens you see here, sesame seeds, as non-dairy dietary sources. Okay. There are many, as I mentioned earlier, non-essential micronutrients. And we look at some of these. So carotenoids. Carotenoids are colorful pigments that lend the color to fruits and vegetables. They're not the only health-promoting components of fruits and vegetables, but they are some of them. So if we take lutein and zeaxanthin in leafy greens, which are drawn to the macula like a magnet and protect against age-related macular degeneration, shown in clinical trials. Lycopene, which is a reddish pinkish hue to things like tomatoes or watermelon, which is great this time of year. We will often think about this for prostate health, but actually good clinical trial data of lycopene for lipid management. Then you get alpha and beta carotene, which, as the name suggests, are in carrots and other orange-colored vegetables. Then you get the polyphenols, which feed gut bacteria and have some anti-inflammatory effects through that mechanism. But things like resveratrol in red wine, curcumin in the spice turmeric, anthocyanidins in berries, EGCG in green tea, and a whole bunch of other flavonoids, dark chocolate. A lot of these foods that have health-promoting properties have polyphenols. And these first two rows are all plant sources. There are micronutrients that are better sourced from animal foods, such as choline in the egg yolks. So I'm a nutritional epidemiologist by training, and eggs is a perfect case study in some of the challenges of nutritional epidemiology because, 1 week eggs are good for you, the next they're bad. And frankly, a lot of that comes down to what were the other dietary factors that were adjusted for? Did they adjust for sugar? Did they adjust for other hydrogenated oils or these types of things? And a lot of times they don't. So it can really just be a proxy of what kind of lifestyle somebody is leading. In any case, you have things like L-carnitine that's in red meat. If one's going to eat red meat, we suggest grass-fed. As we'll see, they're quite different. Coenzyme Q10, if you're wondering what those are, that's actually, those are sardines. Coenzyme Q10 is essential for muscle function, mitochondrial function. So patients taking statins Statins deplete coenzyme Q10, so it's often recommended to take a supplement when there's some good clinical trial data for that too. And I think sometimes if there are misconceptions that are I think like a 10-year-old might realize that a calorie of an orange and a calorie of an orange flavored sugar beverage are going to be different. They are. And that's due in large part to the impact of the micronutrients that have all kinds of signaling and anti-inflammatory properties. As you see, just contrasting an orange and the orange sugar drink here. So while the quantity of calories is important, the quality is equally as important. And a calorie is not a calorie, it's just not that simple. So think about both quantity and quality when it comes to calories. And I just finished showing pictures, so you see a lot of color here. And despite all of the fighting that goes on, which diet is best, we're going to actually look at some of them that are pitted against one another. We see a paleo style diet here. When we do the paleo diets in deep focus, we'll see actually that there's dozens of different kinds of paleo diets, if not hundreds. It's really about eating real whole food. But if we see here, we see a lot of the color in the fruits and vegetables. We see protein sources. We see things like green tea and nuts and seeds and so on for snacks and spices and herbs. But a vegetarian diet is not that much different, really. We're just substituting out some of the protein sources. This would be a lacto-ovo vegetarian. Lacto meaning it's got dairy products, ovo, it's got eggs. And we'll get more into that when we do the vegetarian and plant-based session. And even vegan diets. There's more in common than there is here that conflicts with one another. Vegan diets, there are some supplements that are really necessary, B12, for many, getting a good protein source to make sure they're getting a full spectrum of amino acids. But you see more in common here with a whole food-based approach to any of these diets. And it really suggests that you, for your own lives and those of your friends and family, but also when you get into patient care, start thinking beyond the dietary dogma. It is much more liberating for your patients and gives a lot more choices and ownership in the process. So you see many people are indeed moving beyond, sort of identity of diet and, things like vegan diet, which is actually cleverly sort of combining paleo and vegan. Again, although you don't need red meat in a paleo diet at all, but I think that's what's often thought of here. Mediterranean paleo, that's sort of what our diet recipes that you're going to do today, what you're going to cook, are based around. You get those that just get back into what did people eat before we got into this focus on different popular diets. And Michael Pollan, you may be familiar with him, is in defense of food, where if you had a sort of elevator speech, he said eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Now, some people would disagree with that, but I think for most, if you had to have a conversation with a patient, you had 10 seconds, that might be a pretty good thing to do. And then, there's all kinds of other factors, whether getting locally for potentially more nutrients and the positive impact on the environment, organic, non-GMO, these are all things that we can talk about in the live question and answer session. And really, I suggest you think about this more when it comes to as a Venn diagram. What's in common. We see paleo and vegan. There's quite a bit there, actually, as opposed to, which one is better or, more conflict sort of. And really, just remember this image that there are many paths to nutrient density. There's lots of ways to eat well, if you have that focus on whole foods, right? How do we apply this in clinical practice? The reality is that for those in primary care or most other settings, you don't have a whole lot of time to get deep into the weeds, but there are some things that can be helpful to make this happen in, unlimited amount of, when you've got a limited amount of time in a clinical encounter. First is to convey the flexibility in patient choices, and again, avoid that ideology. Avoid saying, the only way to eat is a vegan diet, or you need to cut back fat, or you need to cut back, you need to do a strict low carb diet or something like that. there are times and places for that, but nutrition is not even close to a one-size-fits-all proposition, and there are many nutrient-dense ways to eat. And I think when you get into the rigid ideology, this can be tough, and we've seen this, where patients will hop from diet to diet to diet. They'll do it for a while, they'll do pretty well, they can't keep it up, they fail, they go back to eating horribly, and then repeat the process sometime later, usually around New Year's, or the beach season. So we really need to think about food differently, and the choice gives patients ownership in the process. And you can provide patients with a one-page resource sheet. So this could be some of the basics on overcoming barriers to healthy eating we'll talk about today, websites that you like, and then developing a referral network of high-quality nutrition professionals. So anyone can call themselves a nutritionist, but those that have a certified nutrition specialist, CNS, certification, registered dietitians, or licensed naturopathic doctors, again, a lot of people can call themselves naturopaths, but those that are licensed typically have a strong understanding of food. And when we get into this topic of overcoming barriers to healthy eating, this is very important. And I like this graphic here, the bad, good, better, best principle. And really, you've certainly probably heard the saying, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. The same applies certainly when it comes to nutrition. Let's just take a look at the first row of fruits and vegetables. Bad would be not eating any. And we have a lot of patients that fall into this. Good would be getting conventional fruits and vegetables, okay, or getting them in cans, getting them in frozen. That's good, and that's a big step away from, if someone's eating, fast food or, a lot of refined foods of any sort. Better would be to use the dirty dozen, clean 15 rule if you can. We'll look at what that is. And the best would be buying all organic, local, and seasonal, or growing your own. And frankly, not many people can do that. I couldn't do that. All right. So this is something that we look at this across the board. If you're going to do meat, where grain-fed, processed meat is bad, and the best would be grass-fed, non-processed meat, pasture-raised, that type of stuff. Okay, but not letting some of the intermediaries, because people, that may be all they can afford, that may be all they have access to, that may be all they're ready to do, in terms of behavior change. All right, so this is a really big one. We can all think about that too, where we've made a mistake, we've deviated from a diet, or we didn't have access to something, and they can, let's say you have a cookie, and there's a tendency, well, God, I've come off my diet, I just eat the whole bag. We see this, and really, it's not an all or nothing. All right, we just do the best we can with what we have. The time, this is a big one, and you're going to see this as you get into your training. A lot of ways that you can make the most of the situation. This is going to apply in patient care to everyone. Just about everybody is busy. You got things going on. So cooking in bulk. This is not a picture from my kitchen, but it could be, because I will often cook, a dozen eggs at a time, hard boil them, and then you have them, for however long it is that you need. Okay, and then, these are good sort of portable things you can bring with you. A slow cooker is an excellent investment. For $20, you can put whatever it is you want in the morning. You come back from class, or a patient comes back from work, and it's ready. You didn't burn the house down. Getting vegetables that are pre-cooked or pre-cooked, but pre-cut saves a lot of time. I see a picture there too that, cooking in bulk, like for example, on a Sunday night, you can get it. You see here that they have put it into containers, you freeze them, and then you've got them throughout the week. This is another good strategy. Getting pre-cooked or pre-seasoned meats is another thing that saves some time. Healthy snacks. This is an area where the market has really driven a lot of great options. You see here, Kind bars or Epic bars if you eat meat. These are portable. You can bring them with you and have them when you're studying. And then healthy meal delivery services. This is another option. This costs a little bit more, but there are lots of these days as well. So these are some strategies to help overcome the time barrier. Now, this would seem to be one of the first places people go, but often gets overlooked, and that's the taste barrier. Let's say if you've ever said, I want to cut back on sugar, and tried and had a really hard time doing it, a lot of it comes down to physiology with this. So you may have heard, or seen, some of the memes about it, but sugar being more addictive than cocaine. So there's actually a peer-reviewed study on this that shows that it does really tap into the dopamine, the reward mechanisms, the way many drugs do. All right, so if you've ever tried and just felt that craving so strongly, you feel like you gave in, there's a reason for that. So what's one way to get around that? Would be something like this. It would be to cut the amount of sugar you're eating in half for the first week, and then maybe another half the second week, and then maybe you remain there. Or you could continue on some kind of strategy like that, depending on how much sugar you have and how much you're looking to cut back on. I had someone that I worked with that was drinking 8 Cokes a day, and cut down to 4 for a while, because there you got a bunch of things going on. You've got sugar, you've got caffeine, and then down to 2, and then down to 1, and then eventually went to another thing altogether. So, but if you tried to cut back on that all at once and do a total 180, it's going to be very difficult. Now, that said, if we're talking sugar, I would mentioned earlier, limit artificial sweeteners. Having some Splenda here and there, no problem. But doing what many people do, where they pour it in by the bag into certain things, that is going to cause some issues. There's a lot of data that this can damage gut flora. So things that, for the sweet taste, that the sweet tooths that many people have, is to, fruit and berries, these types of things, small amounts of honey, maple syrup, a lot of these sweeteners that the body recognizes. And, a lot of the artificial sweeteners are many magnitudes stronger sweetness than sugar has, which you can't trick the body like that. And then for other types of flavors, savory, cooking with spices and herbs is a great way. We have worked quite a bit with underserved communities in Baltimore with kids, and they love cooking with spices and herbs. It's creativity. There's color. There's flavor to it. There's a sense of ownership. Like, hey, this is what I came up with. So, not to mention the fact that spices and herbs have many of them have potent anti-inflammatory effects, like turmeric and ginger and so on. Cinnamon and cloves and fenugreek can help manage blood sugar. There's a lot there that they're good to add into the diet. Other things, though, to watch out for are substitute foods. So some of them are straight up unhealthy. So things like Beyond Burger, Impossible Burger, those things are, while ethically they may resonate with people, and actually the ethical story of that, we're not one to judge ethics, but in terms of planetary health, these are very highly processed and take quite a bit of energy to produce, and they're actually not as good for the planet as would be pasture-raised hamburger itself. All right, so this is not such a clear story, but we're really focused here more on health, and these are not at all healthy. They're very highly processed. That said, again, having it once in a while, not the end of the world, but to subsist on a lot of these substitute foods is a problem. What can be good are substitute foods of things like cauliflower rice, which we'll be doing, zoodles, zucchini noodles, these types of things. Now, I will warn you that if you haven't had them, it's a lot of fun to do, actually. So it's a way to add variety. But if you haven't had them, don't try to fool your friend or partner to think that these are going to taste just like rice. I have a friend who made cauliflower mashed potatoes for her boyfriend, just trying to get him to cut back on the refined carbs a little bit. And as a surprise, and he said, something's wrong with these. So they're good on their own merits. You may not be able to fool somebody, but it is worth doing, and it can have some variety in the diet. And then things like cooking shows and blogs, just to avoid monotony. For some people, it's very important to have a lot of variety in the diet, and that's a way to do it. Cost. This is a big one, and this is one that you'll likely face in a lot of different ways. So one thing we can do is to suggest patients to buy things in bulk, and this could be a lot of different foods. So if it's things like nuts and seeds or grains or legumes or whatever it might be, to buy these in bulk, it really cuts down on the price. This would also apply to things like frozen vegetables and fish, which is exactly what we have done in the recipes we'll be showing you. And to prioritize the health effects of purchases. And what I mean by this is I think this is especially important for things like choosing wild-caught fish. And you can get big bags of frozen wild-caught salmon that are accessible to many people's budgets. Same thing with grass-fed beef. Not everyone can afford these, unfortunately, due to our food subsidies for things like corn and soy, which are really, really cheap. But with vegetables, we have more flexibility. And this is that Dirty Dozen Clean 15 list I was talking about. So let's say that you've got someone who, that is interested in having some organic food, and it is not so much about the nutrient content. A lot of the data has gone back and forth with that, but we do know that organic food has fewer pesticide residues. But not everyone can afford to eat much organic, or certainly not all of it. So the Clean 15 list are those that had the least pesticide residues. So look at on the list things like avocados, sweet corn, pineapple, melons, and so on. The reason being is that we don't eat the skin, the outer layer of this, and that's a pretty good rule of thumb. There's some other exceptions here too, versus those on the Dirty Dozen list, strawberries and spinach, kale. I think, multiple samples, if you look at the graphic here, kale showed 18 different pesticides. So, it's just something where I think we need to make priorities with this. And this is a nice, easily accessible. There's even an app guide for patients or yourself. If you're someone who eats meat, inexpensive cuts of meat are actually outstanding in the slow cooker. So we look at combining some of the strategies. Things like chicken thighs are actually better than chicken breasts, and they cost, half to, maybe a quarter even as much. And if you get bulk legumes, soaking them, this is something that traditional cultures did. In this picture, you see these soapy-looking bubbles. That's not left over from the wash. That will actually come out when you get legumes. These are called saponins that can interfere with gut function and cause gut inflammation. And when you soak them and then rinse them, you get rid of a lot of these saponins and makes them easier to digest. And then finally, this is something where our access has been limited in COVID times, but limiting eating and ordering out. There's no two ways around it, that it is relatively expensive to do so. If you cook at home, especially if you use some of the strategies we talked about, buying in bulk, frozen, and some of these things, you can save quite a bit of money and still connect as is appropriate these days. Okay, so again, we could talk more about barriers and other barriers that you might have encountered in the live Q&A, but wanted to move on now to culinary medicine itself. And this is something, a movement now that we're in, that began at Tulane University School of Medicine. It was started by a guy named Tim Harlan, who was a chef in a first career before going to medical school, and essentially, had nutrition education combination through lecture and cooking. That was an elective course, and now they've had many students go through the elective course, and it's at many academic medical institutions. Although we're very fortunate at the University of Maryland School of Medicine to be the first, and still to my knowledge the only school that has it as part of the core curriculum. So quite a bit of credit goes to Drs. Retner and Satan for having this in ICM 1 and 2. And outcomes are being collected across institutions, including our own. So thank you for providing data in the surveys. It won't take you very much time. Look at some of the data. At Tulane, we saw things, and we've seen this pretty consistently across institutions, improved abilities in nutrition counseling and personal diet quality as compared to standard nutrition education in a more didactic-only approach. Okay, and we're not going to get too deep into the methods of the papers today, but you'll have the citations if you want to check them. Once again, we've seen nutrition knowledge, counseling, and food identification at USC. More comfort in the kitchen at Texas Tech, more confidence in being able to cook, which is something that can be intimidating for some people. And then in these sort of teaching kitchen settings, looking at patient outcomes, some improvements in diabetic patients, and the shared medical appointment model, which is becoming more and more common across different modalities, increased nutrition and lifestyle knowledge. It's an encouraging field, and one that we're contributing to with our data as well. Looking specifically at what you're going to encounter over the next couple of years in the medicine sessions, we are at we'll be back in the teaching kitchen, hopefully, and be continuing to have credit for you as medical students. There's CME for medical professionals. We're actually beginning clinical cooking classes for patients. If you're interested in being a part of that, please feel free to contact me, and we can find roles for you to help out. But also there's quite a bit of community cooking that we've been doing, and particularly for underserved families in Baltimore. And this is a picture. You can see how engaged the student is. This was at a high school in Baltimore where we use spices and herbs and other ways to engage students in Baltimore in cooking, and it was quite successful. We published the data called Spice My Plate, that particular. The way the class structure works is there's the evidence-based health instruction, which we're doing now, really diving into practical nutrition matters. This was one we did. Meat. Should one eat red meat or not? What does the data say? And we're going to continue to do that. Cooking together. Now, this is something that, while we can't do this now or into the future, you see an outline, a schematic diagram there of the teaching kitchen, where there's rollout tabletops that have cooking stations that you'll be able to cook together in groups. So you see here, that's not actually from our class, and there's no white chef's hats, but we will be doing that together again at some point in the future. And then eating together. This is an important sort of lost art in a lot of ways, but we will be doing a live Q&A to sort of simulate. All right, and going to close with Mediterranean diets. And really, you see, it's plural. There's no one Mediterranean diet. It's going to be true for a lot of the popular diets that we're going to get into during the course of this training. But the goal is to emulate the diets of cultures living along the Mediterranean Sea. And these can be quite different. So if you look at perhaps the way people in Egypt or southern France or Italy eat, it's going to be different, even within Italy. You probably tell from my name, I'm of Italian descent. So different regions eat differently, but there's some commonalities there. And while we looked, sort of at the low fat and low carb comparisons head-to-head in research, which are many, this is neither a low fat nor low carb. It varies. It can be any. I've got an example there, but it could really vary. There's lower carbohydrate Mediterranean diets. It's sort of like what we're doing today, as it's somewhat more appropriate for diabetic or patients or those with metabolic syndrome. But there's no restrictions around this. There are some, preferences for certain things we'll look at on subsequent slides. But the fact that there's no calorie counting, there's no macronutrient counting, this helps support long-term compliance, which is one of the reasons why we're focusing on this one first. It's been embraced by many leading health organizations. Recommended foods. You see some on this suggested plate here. We'll get into it. Doesn't need to look just like that by any means. Abundant plant foods, vegetables, fruit, whole grains, legumes, spices, herbs, nuts, and so on. Abundant olive oil. Moderate amounts of dairy, and it's often fermented dairy like cheese and yogurt. And we'll look at that has, a more positive effect, less problems for a lot of people than would milk or ice cream or some of the non-fermented dairy. So I'll talk about that later. Moderate amounts of fish, poultry, and eggs. When it comes to red wine, this is one that is low to moderate, depending upon what you consider low to moderate, but about a glass a day. And then low red meat, sugar, and refined carbohydrates. We'll look at some of those as well. But basically, you see here the plate is half or so, non-starchy vegetables. You get some starchy, vegetables that whole grains, something like salmon, for example. Dessert might be different fruit, and then ample amounts of water and tea or coffee, these types of things. This pyramid just shows, this is one example, but you could flip a fair amount of these things around, except maybe at the very top. What are some of the advantages of this? Well, for one, there's a very, very strong evidence base. We're going to look at some of the systematic reviews and meta-analyses of this. It's one of the best studied dietary approaches out there. There are hundreds of years of real-world practice. So what I mean by this is that, it's one of the sort of a traditional diet that stood the test of time. So there are diets that have quite a bit of clinical evidence, but limited real-world practice. An example, this would be a ketogenic diet. You don't see too many populations out there eating a ketogenic diet. Now, as we will see next year for you, there are some really, encouraging applications of this, whether it's epilepsy, cancer, cognitive decline, or even just performance. But we haven't looked a whole lot. What does that look like over the course of many years, as we have with Mediterranean diets? High nutrient density, and again, compliance and sustainability are better than a lot of other diets. It's a good starting point for a lot of people. You don't need to count carbs or fat or anything like that. There's a lot of variety of different foods, and it can be relatively affordable, particularly if you go with some of the cost-saving strategies we talked about with getting things frozen, getting them in bulk, and so on and so forth. There aren't a whole lot of disadvantages for healthy people. There are some for whom there might be better diets. So someone's obese and looking to lose weight or diabetic. Things like bread, pasta, legumes, and rice, these starchy, insulinogenic carbs are really not the best, but you can do a modified Mediterranean diet, sort of like we're doing today, where we're having a substitute for rice with cauliflower rice, right? Red meat intake is very limited. Processed red meat is likely harmful. When we do the plant-based diets later on in the year, we'll see that non-processed red meat and some recent papers suggest that red meat itself may not be harmful, and that it is a good source of iron and B vitamins and so on. So if someone's struggling with anemia, or some other micronutrient deficiencies, avoiding all red meat may not be the best ideal. You can supplement around it. You certainly don't need red meat. But some people think this may have been a sort of not the silver bullet solution by any means, just cutting red meat out of the diet. And then grains, legumes, and dairy can be problematic for some people, particularly those with autoimmune disease. We'll look at some ways around that, some ways to mitigate that as presentation. Going to get into some of the practical application here, and just the way you saw the earlier slides that had the package, really sugary, low-fat foods, and the low-carb foods are full of fake sugars. Mediterranean diets can be bastardized just the same. So to be very clear, Mediterranean diet done right does not contain the Olive Garden's never-ending pasta pass. It's not how they eat for those that have gone to Mediterranean regions, and it's certainly not going to be health promoting. The same would go with wine. All right, it's one glass of wine a day, not 3 or 4. So really, there's some good modified Mediterranean diets that are out there, and again, we're going to be preparing cauliflower fried rice today. If this is, if you're going to have legumes and grains, I'd suggest getting them in bulk. It saves quite a bit of money. And soaking them overnight. It doesn't cost anything more to put them in a bowl and pour water over it and then rinse it. Okay, not a lot of effort either. And the reason being is that legumes and grains contain what are called anti-nutrients. These are components that bind to nutrients, minerals such as calcium, iron, and zinc, various enzyme inhibitors that can bind to trypsin and interfere with protein digestion. Good news is that we've shown actually some work that we did at the University of Maryland School of Medicine that soaking and sprouting can reduce this anti-nutrient content. And but that's not where the issues end. They also contain lectins, which are inflammatory proteins. You may have heard about this. Stephen Gundry talks a lot about this these days. This can trigger autoimmunity. Nice thing here is that pressure cooking can greatly reduce lectins. Something like an Instapot, which some of you may have. Now these cost a little bit more than a crock pot or slow cooker, although it does have a slow cooking function. But if you are someone that likes legumes and grains and so on, you can try pressure cooking them, and say you're having some either GI issues or autoimmunity, and this may help. Next up is dairy. If one is going to consume dairy, ideally you want to consume fermented dairy. Fermented just means fermented with probiotic bacteria or yeast. Probiotics is something that we'll encounter at the dietary supplements lectures as you go through your training. So these are things like yogurt in a lot of European countries here, kefir, we see a lot of that, lassi in India, and a couple of reasons for this. So the prevalence of lactose intolerance is relatively high. It tends to increase with age, and fermenting the probiotic bacteria dramatically reduces the lactose content because the bacteria consume the lactose. All right. However, fermentation does not solve all issues. So there are some people who have dairy or casein allergies, and cow's milk is problematic even if fermented. The good news is that there is goat milk, sheep milk, or something that's called C2, cow-derived dairy, are often tolerable. So things to think about here. If a patient does have the means, grass-fed dairy is preferred. It's got greater concentration of the anti-inflammatory omega-3 fats, less of the inflammatory omega-6 fats. Then, wild-caught salmon or other fish, if possible. A picture often says 1,000 words. In this case, you see what farm-raised salmon looks like. It's a pale gray, sickly color, because sadly the fish themselves are quite sickly. Very concentrated, really, frankly, pretty gross living conditions. From a pure health perspective, more omega-3 than farm-raised and wild-caught salmon. There's less antibiotic resistance, and there aren't the dyes that are used to achieve the color. So if you get farm-raised salmon and it looks pinkish or orangish reddish the way wild-caught does, it's often dyes that got there. Good news is, now if you go and get a piece of fresh wild-caught salmon, it's going to be pretty expensive, but tilapia, whatever else it might be, but you can get bulk purchase frozen wild-caught fish that fits many budgets. And then Mediterranean diet is not going to be one where there's a whole lot of red meat consumed, but when it is going to be consumed, limited amounts of non-processed red meat. There's been a lot of data over the years that have shown that it's the processed red meat, the stuff like Slim Jims or hot dogs, that cause issues due to the nitrites and nitrates. But non-processed does not. Again, we're going to look at some data in a later session from the Archives of Internal Medicine, these very large systematic reviews and meta-analyses that corroborated these findings. So we want to stay away from that stuff. When, in true Mediterranean fashion, not going to be having, meat coming from situations like you see here on the left, okay? That's a concentrated animal feed operation, or CAFO, where the animals are very close to one another in conditions that make them ill, not to mention the poor treatment that they receive, versus on the right, where they're eating what they're meant to eat, which is grass, in much more humane conditions, far better for the environment as well. And you may come across regenerative agriculture. If you're interested in the impact of food on the environment, look into that. That's actually, more and more seems to be has the least harm on the planet, even more than things like the Beyond Burgers or Impossible Burgers, which have a lot of processing and so on. Regenerative agriculture is the animals and plants all in one system. It's a lot of fascinating work going on there. From a pure health perspective, grass-fed meat, again, has higher omega-3 content and lower omega-6. But in Mediterranean diets, there would not be a whole lot of red meat. That which is there, it's a lot of times not just what you eat, it's how you prepare it and how you eat it. Let's say that someone is not going to give up their love of steaks. If you just grill the heck out of it, like you see on the left, without marinating, it's going to create these heterocyclic amines, which are carcinogens and advanced glycation end products, which oxidize LDL, which is problematic, as opposed to something that's braised or in a slow cooker. Spices and herbs. If you love, again, we don't want to let perfect be the end of good. So if you're someone who loves a burger on the grill, marinate it with some olive oil and spices and herbs. It considerably cuts down on the formation of heterocyclic amines. Okay. We're going to close on looking at some of the clinical research of this. So Mediterranean diets, once again, they are one of the most researched popular diets. You look at some of the numbers here. We're going to focus on the systematic reviews and meta-analyses of Mediterranean diets And starting first, a diet is only as good as its adherence. So one of the reasons that we, once again, we focus on this to start is that adherence is quite possible with Mediterranean diets. And this is among both adults and children or adolescents. For anyone who has children, it's tough to cook, a meal for oneself and for kids. This is one that, a separate one for kids. This is one where the adherence is quite high. We look at over 4 million patients in these. So this is an important real-world effectiveness. We don't live in metabolic wards, tightly controlled conditions where we have our food delivered to us. We have to make it, and this is one of the nice things about the diet. And if we look at some of the disease risk and sort of prognosis and outcomes, the total N of the systematic reviews and of prospective studies we see here are over 5 million. We look at it for weight loss and management. It is one of the options. There are many, but switching from a standard American diet to Mediterranean diet has been associated with weight loss and management, reductions in cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes, many cancers. Then we look at with the aging of the population, the importance in cutting down on cognitive decline and frailty. And not surprisingly, given the fact that cardiovascular disease and cancer are the 1 and 2 killers in the U.S., total mortality. So Mediterranean diets are a great choice, one of many that we're going to go through. And I look forward to seeing you in the Q&A. Here's my email if you'd like to email me or interested in getting involved with our work. And I hope you enjoy the cooking and that you find this session informative, practical.